This week I got to thinking a lot about emotion, and one of the places I begin is if you've ever been in a situation where you feel uneasy, you feel a little bit afraid, something doesn't feel quite right, maybe you feel like someone is watching you or something in your immediate environment is out of place, and then you have an explanation for it. Someone came in that you didn't know about and rearranged all your stuff. You have a name for what it is that you found disturbing or upsetting. Naming something that makes you feel a certain way is such a relief. If you have a bunch of symptoms and you can't find an explanation and you go to the doctor and the doctor can diagnose it, maybe the doctor even tells you that it's incurable, but just to have a name for it is such a relief. And if you recognize that situation, if you've been there before, then that is a clue to the power of narrative. And so when people who want power, who want to be in a position of leadership, who want to be able to marshal your assent and your votes as a way to get what they want, as a raw resource that they will then manufacture into influence and wealth, when they can tell a story that puts together your feeling of unease and your feeling of discomfort and gives it a name, they can get you to disregard reality. If that narrative includes an explanation for what does or should count as evidence, if that narrative includes elements that explain to you why it's okay to completely disregard facts, then it's particularly insidious. And just last night, I got to wondering, this is something that I almost want to go out and do a little digging and a little reading about. It seems as though for a large part of our history, people in this country, probably outside this country as well, but it's part of the agricultural and the frontier chapter in the history of the United States, because of much of what we were up against, because many of the biggest challenges and difficulties came from natural forces. I don't know if I'm being romantic or naive, but it really does seem as though what people circulated as their standard, what would change their opinion, what they felt justified a belief was, show me evidence. I got to thinking about Missouri, and its nickname is the Show Me State. And there are a lot of people who they farmed for a living, and if someone came along and could talk pretty but couldn't back it up, there was a time when people were proud to be people of few words. And it seems as though cutting through what someone said and demanding evidence and being skeptical unless people could give you an airtight case, it seems as though maybe that was associated with being more vigilant against natural forces. If the things that you had to do to be secure, if the things that you had to do to have food, clothing, and shelter involved adapting to some features of the natural world that were cyclical and could be predicted, and then other features of the natural world that could strike without warning, then I think, I don't know, this is a thought that's in its very, very early stages. It seems as though that disposed people to be less likely to gobble down someone else's narrative and to change their view of reality based on a conspiracy, based on dividing the world into us and them, based on things like just labeling information fake news and dismissing it, or making assertions that are easily checked, but trusting that the people who follow you will not bother to check them and will not trust any source that disputes your version of events, because you're the one to be trusted, and if another source provides evidence that you're incorrect, well, that just proves that other source is part of the enemy, and they should not listen to that other source, they should listen only to you. And that goes back to demagoguery, which I've talked about in the past. It seems as though where we're stuck right now is that we don't have any interest in solving problems. We see public life as this sifting progress, too many of us do, sifting process for separating enemies from allies. And I think about if the fire department were to show up to a burning building and the firefighters all just kind of lined up, and they weren't doing anything. And you said, what are you doing? This building is burning down. There are people inside who are going to die. And they said, but we're stopping Bob from using a hose. We hate Bob. And that was absolutely the only accomplishment they needed to feel satisfied. They were stopping Bob from getting his hands on the hose, but they weren't putting out the burning building. That's where we're stuck right now. So what I have jotted down to try to make sense of is the idea of accuracy versus emotional fidelity. And it seems as though we've given up on the idea of accuracy, that there are too many people who've thrown up their hands and just sort of persuaded themselves that accuracy doesn't exist, that you can find a source that says anything. So it's just a matter of picking the source that you want to go with. And really what you do is you just cherry pick available evidence until the conclusions you can draw follow the direction your emotions are already traveling. You shape your perceptions with your emotional inertia, your emotional momentum. So even if it can be proven beyond dispute that violent crime is falling in the United States, that as far as your likelihood of being a victim of a violent crime, the odds are lower than they have been since decades and decades ago, even if that can be proven, if you don't feel safe, well, then crime must be on the rise. And I have to say, over the weekend, I wrote a long Facebook post about this. I got completely fed up with seeing a slogan that deep down I agree with, but the slogan itself is completely unhelpful, and it's a symptom of a recurring pattern that I think is completely unhelpful, and that is, healthcare is a human right. Now let me say, I think any decent community will take care of people whose life or health is endangered. And a community that will allow people to die and will stand by and not help them is a community that I don't want to be a part of, and frankly, I don't think is a civilized community. I think they're savages. But just repeating that conclusion, repeating it. And now it's got to the point where some people's strategy is they want to take members of Congress and get them on record on that one line. They want to, if possible, go to town halls and they want to say, yes or no, is healthcare a human right? And speaking as a communication guy, this is not helping. This is counterproductive. What I wrote into my long-winded Facebook post is that conflict management 101, if you want to move forward and make progress and salvage that healthy relationship with the other party to the conflict, is you back off your position and you talk about your interest. You don't just repeat your demand over and over again. So you don't take anything that is short, cut and dried, and conclusionary and try to twist the arm of the other to get them to affirm it. You don't use a wedge issue when you're trying to make politics and civic life more healthy. So maybe you listen while someone who is a Republican voter says, I am already struggling to keep all the utilities paid and to keep a roof over my family's head. And I am worried that a government agency will approve elective cosmetic surgery just because bureaucracies are inefficient and they try to operate to formula, and they are very, very imperfect in their judgments. And that approval of someone else's elective cosmetic surgery will mean a bigger bite out of my paycheck. My kids are going to go hungry because someone who's sitting in a federal office somewhere said that someone was entitled to surgery that they really don't need. And if that's my understanding of what single payer might be, then I'm going to fight that tooth and nail. And I'm not even saying that that's a good argument, but I'm saying that that is an explanation for being opposed to healthcare reform, that you could at least recognize that's genuinely stressful for the person holding on to it. And that's a basis for having a conversation and saying, okay, if that were to happen, I agree with you. That would be awful. So if we were to move forward with a reform like this, these are steps we need to take. And then maybe what I could say to someone to explain my view of it would be, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And the person who'd started that conversation said, well, okay, who counts as my neighbor according to that command? And Jesus taught the parable of the Good Samaritan. And there were people who walked by and would not help the man who had been beaten and was dying by the side of the road. And the one who was his neighbor, the one who was in compliance with Jesus' command, was the one who helped, and the one who gave of his resources. And even when the man who'd been beaten was left at the inn in town, the Samaritan offered to pay the man's bill, left money to pay the man's bill. And so if I talk about, I think, people who've been in the insurance industry, if we were ever to get to the point where we were to go to, if we ever did adopt a single-payer system, which you probably can figure out I'm in favor of, there are a lot of people who've made a career and who may have bought houses and are now putting kids through college based on the income that comes from being in healthcare administration. And a reform like this might be the end of their career. And honestly, if they fight that reform, I know that I am not on their team. I hope that they lose that fight, but I feel some compassion for them. And when you think about the reasons behind it, when you think about the reasons behind the demands, when you can get away from government takeover of healthcare on the one hand, and is healthcare or is it not a human right on the other hand, and when you can recognize in the other person's reasons, you recognize their needs, and you can recognize what makes them anxious, that's where that relationship can actually motivate you and the other person to think about some ways to adopt solutions that unite you. Now, I have to say, there are too many people who occupy political office who don't want that to happen because they don't want shifting coalitions. They don't want you reaching across the divide and finding a solution together with that other group, because these office holders are weaving together a narrative and they want to make it predictable. They want their block to be a stable block. And as hard as it is for me to get to this point, I am at this point, I even feel compassion for them, because they do a job that is difficult. And if I were a career political office holder, I am very confident that I would try to identify who my block of support was, and I would try to find appeals that worked for them, and I would try to have give and take with my block to where those appeals became recognizable and stable. And you would too. You could not do that job unless you did something similar. And one of the unfortunate forms of collateral damage that comes off that process is people are separated from one another. So I was talking earlier about emotional inertia, about how emotional fidelity is a standard that seems to have replaced accuracy in what people accept as true about the world. And one of the things I think we do, and I know I've talked about this in past weeks, the infrahumanizing of people who are in the out group. In other words, thinking of other people as having only very simple, very primary emotions. They're happy, they're mad. You, on the other hand, recognize that you have blended and conflicting emotions. Something might feel bittersweet. You might feel ambivalent. You might be excited but a little scared. Multiple emotions at one time. But when we think of people as our enemies, we don't think they can have those kinds of emotions. We don't think of them as having complex thoughts. We think they hate groups, or they love this, or they're greedy. And so they're greedy, and they know that they're greedy, and they hate me, and they don't care that I'm in danger and can't get good health care. And I hear people describe their political opponents that way, and I think, is that really plausible? When you interact with people, how many people do you genuinely interact with? Not for the purpose of telling a story to the people who agree with you, but how many people do you genuinely interact with who are cartoon villains? And if you're not encountering that many, then your explanation of those in the other group as cartoon villains is just not very plausible. But it seems as though people don't care whether it's plausible. I think that people have learned tricks and gotten habituated to skepticism, and not healthy skepticism, reflex skepticism, knee-jerk skepticism, and contempt, and writing political commentators and news reporters off as liberal and biased or wingnuts. Deflection to cherry-pick what confirms their emotions. I think that emotional yardstick, I think it's implicit. But maybe if we could make it explicit, if we could help people recognize when they're doing it, that people are not doing a very good job of exercising quality control over the evidence that they allow to change their minds. And if they could see that it is healthy when they take seriously evidence and reasoning that challenges what they normally believe, not because they're going to change their beliefs 10 times a day, but because all of us from time to time get tied to an idea that is not accurate. And if we take these inaccurate, not helpful, not constructive ideas and we follow them too far, we can do a lot of damage to our lives and to our communities. And so constantly testing and being open to what would test what we've believed. If people could understand that that's part of critical thinking, and critical thinking is kind of a dirty phrase, a scare phrase to some people, if we could somehow convey that that's part of wisdom. Part of wisdom is not having settled what you believe, especially on issues that involve change. It's similar, I think. It parallels in my mind the controversy that I heard about on the radio. Once again this morning it comes up with what kinds of history textbooks are we going to have in public schools? Are we going to have history textbooks that talk about events in the history of the United States that are troubling? Are we going to talk about things that the United States was involved in that were dark, are darker chapters? Or are we only going to talk about things that make us proud of our founding fathers, that make us think our country can do no wrong? And there's a theory that you can't raise patriots, you can't raise people who love their country unless everything you tell them about the country is good news. And I think these people must be advertisers and not educators, because really I think they don't think that much about relationships. And the relationship you have with your country in some ways, there are points of resemblance with the relationship you have with your parents. And you're going to discover along the way that your parents are imperfect. But if that imperfection is not taboo, if you're allowed to talk about it, then you can develop an understanding of love that you don't love only perfect people. And you can develop an understanding of patriotism that you're not proud of your country only on the assumption that your country has never done anything wrong. And you can also hold the beliefs that you hold and pay attention to the evidence that comes your way, and you can realize sifting through evidence and assessing how strongly to hold your beliefs, all the evidence doesn't have to go one way. Any evidence that challenges what you believe doesn't have to be dismissed as fake. You can be aware of outliers. You can be aware of the possibility that you've overcommitted to an idea, and the world doesn't have to be black and white. One of the things that I teach in my basic interpersonal communication class, we talk a lot about negative self-talk. And one form of negative self-talk is emotional reasoning. So there are some people who are terrified of flying, and they'll say, well, if I feel this scared, then there must be something dangerous about where I am. And other people, they'll get really angry in situations, and they'll say, well, if I feel this angry, it must be that someone did something wrong. And I talk about how you can get to the point where you recognize your emotions are based on your interpretation. They're not based on objective features of the natural world. I mean, I teach public speaking, and I have a long discussion in there about how the fear of public speaking is a phantom fear. In the same way you eat peppers, you feel pain in your mouth, that's phantom pain. The capsaicin in the pepper is not killing off any of your cells. It may feel hot, but it's not the same kind of hot as when you touch the burner on a stove. So if you can learn to override that sensation of fear, if you can reinterpret and reframe the fear of public speaking as adrenaline, then you can treat it as rocket fuel and you can burn it. If we could get to where we could reframe our emotional response to evidence and reframe our emotional response to people who see political and other civic issues differently, maybe we could use that to motivate ourselves to step out from under the narratives of people who want to use their narrative generation ability to drive their career in office. Maybe we could get to the point where we could defy their efforts and we could reach out to other people in our community, and we could find ways to proceed, ways of moving forward that got at our interests instead of our positions. Maybe.